She raised a Jaguar from a cub, but when his wild instincts surfaced, she was forced to make an impossible decision. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. What happens next will break your heart and change the way you see the bond between humans and animals. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. It all began on a warm, quiet afternoon in the dense jungles of the Amazon. Emily was no stranger to the wilderness. She had spent the majority of her life dedicated to wildlife conservation. She had worked alongside scientists, researchers, and animal behaviorists, always finding herself most at peace surrounded by nature. The sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the calls of distant birds, the gentle humming of insects, had become a comforting symphony in her life. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for the moment she stumbled upon Kumo, the jaguar cub that would change her life forever. Emily had been on a routine excursion through the jungle, documenting various animal species for her conservation project. She knew the land well, the winding paths, the towering trees, and the deep creeks that ran through the thick foliage. But that afternoon, as she ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, she noticed something unusual. A faint sound, like a soft whimper, carried on the air. Her curiosity piqued. Emily followed the sound, her boots crunching against the dry leaves as she moved with careful urgency. She had no idea what it was, but instinct told her it was something that needed her attention. As she pushed through the underbrush, she spotted the source of the sound, a tiny, trembling ball of fur huddled beneath a large fern. At first glance, Emily thought it was a small wild cat, perhaps a puma cub, but as she knelt down closer, her heart stopped in her chest. It was a jaguar cub, vulnerable, small, and desperately in need of help. The cub's big brown eyes looked up at her, filled with confusion and fear. The poor creature was alone, its body skinny from malnourishment, its fur dirty and matted. Emily knew the risks involved in approaching wild animals, particularly big cats like jaguars, but something deep within her urged her to act. She had trained for years in wildlife rehabilitation, and this was a moment that required every ounce of her experience. She gently extended her hand toward the cub, speaking in a calm, soothing voice. "It's okay, little one. I won't hurt you," she whispered. The cub's eyes widened, and for a moment, it hesitated before crawling cautiously toward her outstretched hand. There was something in that fragile moment, some deep unspoken trust between them, that made Emily's heart swell with emotion. She had been in situations like this before, rescuing injured animals, helping lost creatures find their way, but this moment felt different. This was more than just a rescue. This was the beginning of something profound. Carefully, she cradled the cub in her arms, feeling the warmth of its tiny body against her chest. It was clear that the cub had been separated from its mother, likely after a predator attack or some other natural disaster. Emily's training told her that the chances of this cub surviving in the wild without its mother were slim. It would need constant care and protection, something she wasn't sure she could provide, but she knew she had to try. Taking the cub back to her small research cabin on the outskirts of the jungle, Emily made a decision that would change everything. She had spent years studying wild animals, respecting their need for space, for freedom, and for their natural environment. But here she was, holding a jaguar cub in her arms, a creature that was meant to roam the jungle, not be confined to a human home. She could feel the weight of the responsibility that had just been placed on her shoulders. Could she provide the cub with what it needed? Could she truly raise this wild animal in a safe and healthy way? The first few days were a blur. Emily worked around the clock to care for Kumo, as she decided to call him, feeding him a specialized formula to help him regain strength and nutrients. She set up a small area for him inside her cabin, surrounded by blankets and stuffed toys, trying to mimic the warmth and safety he would have had with his mother. But no matter how hard she tried, the feeling of guilt gnawed at her. Kumo wasn't meant to be here. She was doing everything she could to give him a proper life, but the world outside the walls of her cabin was a place he belonged to, not this tiny space. As the days turned into weeks, Emily grew increasingly attached to Kumo. He was a curious cub, always exploring his surroundings, trying to climb onto the couch, investigating every corner of the cabin with wide, innocent eyes. As he grew, so did his appetite, and he began to show more signs of strength. He was no longer the fragile, sickly creature she had found in the jungle. He was gaining weight, and his playful nature started to surface. Emily couldn't help but smile as she watched him chase after sticks and bat at the toys she had bought for him. His playful pounces and curious antics filled the cabin with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the silent, lonely life Emily had lived before. Yet, despite their growing bond, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Kumo was thriving, but he was no longer a wild animal in his natural habitat. He was becoming domesticated, a hybrid of two worlds. She had raised him with the intention of giving him a chance to live a safe life, but deep down, she knew that Kumo needed more than what she could offer him in the confines of her cabin. He needed space to roam, to stretch his legs and run through the jungle as he was meant to do. She was well aware of the danger of keeping a wild animal in captivity for too long. There were risks to both Kumo and her own safety. The more Kumo grew, the more Emily realized that her ability to provide him with the life he deserved was slipping further away. In the quiet moments, Emily would sit by the window and look out at the jungle, imagining Kumo running freely among the trees, his powerful legs carrying him through the dense undergrowth. She had always known that wild animals, no matter how close the bond, could never truly be tamed. They were born to be wild, to roam and hunt in their own domain. But the question lingered in her mind, could she ever bring herself to let Kumo go back to that world? As Kumo grew into a young jaguar, his instincts became stronger. Emily had been warned many times by experts that, despite the bond they had formed, a jaguar would always be a jaguar. It was a wild animal, and no matter how much affection it received, it would never lose its natural instincts. But Emily's heart refused to listen. She told herself that they had something unique, something that transcended the boundaries of nature and instinct. However, the warnings weren't just from experts. There were whispers from the community, too. People who had worked with animals, who understood the power of wild creatures, warned Emily about the dangers of raising Kumo in captivity. They urged her to release him back into the wild before it was too late, before Kumo's instincts took over, and the jaguar became something more dangerous than she could control. It's not about your love for him, they told her. It's about what he needs, and what's safe for both of you. But Emily was determined. She couldn't imagine letting Kumo go. She had raised him, cared for him, and watched him grow into the majestic creature he was becoming. In her heart, she knew she couldn't bear to lose him. She thought that, with time, she could somehow make it work, keep him close, while also allowing him to maintain some of his natural instincts. But as each day passed, the reality of Kumo's wild nature became harder to ignore. Emily was torn between the life she had built for them both, and the life that Kumo truly deserved. One fateful evening, as Emily sat watching Kumo chase a butterfly outside the cabin, a quiet realization washed over her. She had tried to mold Kumo into something he was never meant to be. She had tried to protect him, to save him from the dangers of the wild, but in doing so, she had unwittingly trapped him in a life that was not his own. As Kumo stopped in his tracks and looked back at her, his amber eyes full of confusion, she knew that she couldn't keep him from his true calling any longer. The reality of the situation hit Emily harder than anything else. She had raised Kumo, loved him, and watched him grow, but now, she was facing the hardest decision of her life. Was it better to let him live in captivity, in the safety of her home, or should she release him back into the wild, where he truly belonged? Emily knew that, no matter what, the time had come for her to make the hardest choice a caregiver could face. The bond she had with Kumo would never fade, but she couldn't deny the truth any longer. The jungle was calling him, and Emily had no choice but to listen. As the months passed, the warnings began to grow louder, more urgent. Emily had always prided herself on her deep bond with Kumo. She believed that her connection with him was unbreakable. After all, she had raised him from a tiny, defenseless cub. The early days had been challenging, but Kumo had grown under her care. He had become strong, graceful, and undeniably majestic. To her, he was more than just an animal. He was a companion, a friend, a part of her family. Emily believed, or perhaps she wanted to believe, that their bond was so deep that nothing could sever it. But as Kumo grew, so did the concern from the outside world. Experts in animal behavior, wildlife professionals, and even some of her close friends started to voice their worries. At first, Emily brushed them off. They didn't understand the unique relationship she had with Kumo. They didn't see what she saw, the connection, the trust. But the longer Kumo lived in her sanctuary, the more evident it became that there was a growing gap between Emily's idealism and the reality of the situation. It began with small, seemingly insignificant changes. Kumo, once a playful and affectionate cub, started to become more distant, more unpredictable. He no longer greeted Emily with the same enthusiasm when she entered his enclosure. Instead, he would watch her from the corner of his space, his yellow eyes fixed and intense. His playful demeanor had been replaced by something darker, something wild. He began to display signs of irritation at the smallest things, a shift in his routine, a change in the way he was fed, a simple noise from the outside world. It wasn't aggression, at least not at first, but it was definitely unsettling. The first time Emily noticed the change was one afternoon when she tried to approach Kumo with his favorite toy. It was a tug-of-war rope, something he'd loved playing with ever since he was small. But that day, when she reached into his enclosure, Kumo tensed up. His muscles tightened, and his ears flattened against his head. Emily paused, unsure of how to react. "Kumo," she called softly, but there was no response. She stepped closer, trying to offer him the toy. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Instead of happily grabbing it like he had so many times before, Kumo swiped at her hand with a sudden swipe of his massive paw. She stepped back quickly, her heart racing. It wasn't like him to act that way. At first, Emily chalked it up to the natural changes of adolescence. Kumo was growing into adulthood, and with that came new instincts. She tried not to dwell on it, telling herself that it was just a phase. But as the days passed, the incidents became more frequent. Kumo would growl at unfamiliar sounds, pacing nervously in his enclosure. He became more unpredictable, more wary of everything around him, and less tolerant of the people who had once been a comforting presence in his life. It wasn't long before Emily started hearing from her friends and colleagues who had long been concerned about the risks of keeping a wild animal in captivity. They had seen Kumo's development from afar, and now they were more vocal about their concerns. "You have to understand," Emily, one of her longtime colleagues, Dr. Hargrove, had told her during a phone call one evening. "Kumo is a wild animal. You may have raised him, but his instincts are growing stronger every day. No matter how much you love him, you can't erase what he is. You can't expect him to be a domestic pet forever." Emily had been defensive at first, pushing back against the advice. She had heard similar warnings from others in the past, but this time, it hit harder. Her own doubt began to creep in. Dr. Hargrove wasn't the only one who raised concerns. A fellow wildlife sanctuary owner, Mark, had visited her a few months earlier and was visibly uncomfortable with the sight of Kumo. He had looked at the young Jaguar warily, his body tense as Kumo approached him. "You're taking a big risk," Mark had said. "I don't care how much you love him, but a wild animal is always a wild animal. One day, you might not be able to control him." At the time, Emily had dismissed his words. Mark didn't know Kumo like she did. But now, as she stood in the sanctuary and watched Kumo pacing, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The once playful cub was becoming more elusive, more unpredictable. He didn't respond to her the way he used to. His eyes, once filled with trust and affection, now seemed distant, guarded. The tipping point came on a warm summer afternoon, just a few weeks after Dr. Hargrove's phone call. Emily was walking through the sanctuary, checking on the other animals, when she noticed Kumo in the distance, standing near the edge of his enclosure. He was staring at something intently, his body rigid, his tail flicking agitatedly. Emily hesitated for a moment before walking over to him, calling his name softly. "Kumo, it's okay," she said, trying to calm him down. But as she neared, something shifted in him. With a sudden burst of speed, Kumo leaped toward the gate of his enclosure, his claws scraping against the bars. Emily froze in fear. She had never seen him react like this before. His eyes were wild, unrecognizable. His growls were low, guttural, more primal than anything she'd ever heard from him. In that moment, Emily's instincts kicked in, and she backed away slowly. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the fear she had tried to ignore for so long finally surfaced. Kumo was no longer the playful cub she had raised. He had changed, and in that moment, she realized that she no longer had control over him. It was then that Emily decided it was time to call for help. She couldn't deny the truth anymore. Kumo was becoming dangerous, and she couldn't manage him on her own. She called Dr. Hargrove and asked for his advice. He told her it was time to make a decision. Kumo needed to be relocated. The sanctuary she had so carefully built for him was no longer a safe environment, and neither was her home. The decision was excruciating for Emily. She loved Kumo with every fiber of her being, but she had to acknowledge the reality: keeping him in her sanctuary could lead to disaster. She could feel it in her bones. Kumo's instincts were overtaking the bond they had shared. Emily had spent years nurturing him, raising him, loving him as her own. But now, she had to let go of that dream. She had to put Kumo's well-being first, and that meant finding him a more appropriate home, one where he could live as a wild animal, one where he could be himself, without the pressure of human expectations. The process was painful. Emily reached out to several wildlife sanctuaries and animal rehabilitation centers. Each call felt like another nail in the coffin of the life she had tried so hard to build with Kumo. Each response from the sanctuary experts was the same: Kumo needed to be relocated to a large, remote facility, one where he could roam free in a natural environment with other jaguars. She knew it was the right decision. But the thought of never seeing Kumo again, the animal who had been her closest companion for years, was unbearable. She wasn't ready to say goodbye, but she understood that it was the only way to protect both herself and Kumo. He had outgrown her sanctuary, and it was time for him to live as the wild animal he was destined to be. A week later, Emily found herself standing in front of Kumo's enclosure, watching him closely. He was pacing again, his body tense, his eyes filled with a kind of intensity she had never seen before. She stood still, her heart heavy, knowing what she had to do. "I'm so sorry, Kumo," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to keep you safe, to love you. But now, you need to be free." Kumo stopped pacing and turned toward her, his yellow eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, it felt as if he understood. He came closer to the fence, pressing his face against the bars, as though seeking comfort. Emily reached out to him, her fingers brushing against his fur, but she knew this was the last time they would share a moment like this. The wild animal in him had taken over, and she had to let go. Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped back. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered, her voice breaking. She turned and walked away, knowing she had made the right choice, even though it felt like her heart was being torn in two. Emily had always known that Kumo's growth would come with challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the change she began to see in him. The playful cub she had raised, the one who would curl up beside her every night for warmth, was now a full-grown jaguar, and something was shifting in his demeanor. She had always been cautious, aware that Kumo was a wild animal, despite the bond they shared, but the reality of his transformation was undeniable. Her once carefree life in the sanctuary was now filled with a sense of dread. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it had been gradual. Over the past few months, Kumo's behavior became more erratic. It was subtle at first, small signs that something wasn't quite right. He would growl more often, especially when anyone entered his enclosure. He began pacing back and forth at night, his eyes scanning the surroundings, no longer content to rest beside Emily as he used to. His gaze, once soft and trusting, had become sharp, guarded. He no longer seemed to look at Emily with the same affection. Instead, he regarded her with an intensity she had never seen before. At first, Emily tried to ignore the growing unease in her gut. She told herself that it was just a phase. After all, jaguars were solitary animals by nature, and maybe Kumo was simply adjusting to the changes that came with adulthood. She spent extra time with him, offering him treats, taking him on walks, trying to maintain the bond they had formed when he was just a cub. But it wasn't enough. Kumo's behavior was no longer something she could dismiss. One evening, as the sun set over the jungle, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, Emily stood outside Kumo's enclosure. She watched as he circled the perimeter, his body low to the ground, his tail flicking restlessly. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that felt unnatural. Kumo's movements were more deliberate now, more calculated. He was sizing up his environment, alert in a way that felt foreign to Emily. It was as though he was becoming more aware of the world around him, and more detached from her. Her heart raced as she called his name, trying to draw him closer. But he only glanced at her, his eyes cold and distant. For the first time, Emily felt like a stranger in the sanctuary she had created, and the realization hit her like a wave. The bond she had with Kumo was no longer enough to quell the instincts within him. The wildness inside him was surfacing, and Emily could no longer deny it. The following week, Emily had a scheduled meeting with a local wildlife behaviorist named Dr. Lopez. She had been hesitant to reach out for help, not wanting to admit to anyone, least of all herself, that something was wrong with Kumo. But the growing anxiety in her heart had become too loud to ignore. She needed answers, and she hoped that Dr. Lopez, who had been advising her for years, could provide some clarity. Dr. Lopez arrived in the late morning, carrying a notebook and a few specialized tools to observe Kumo's behavior. She was a tall woman with short, dark hair and an air of calm authority. Emily led her into the sanctuary, and they walked toward Kumo's enclosure together. Emily could feel her stomach twist as they approached, her anxiety building with each step. Dr. Lopez observed Kumo from a distance, jotting down notes as she watched his movements. For a while, Kumo didn't acknowledge them, his back turned as he paced in slow, deliberate circles. Emily watched nervously, waiting for any sign that the behaviorist would voice her concerns. Finally, after several minutes, Dr. Lopez spoke. "He's becoming territorial," she said softly. "That's normal to some extent, as he matures, but the level of aggression I'm seeing is concerning." Emily felt her heart sink. "What do you mean by aggression?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's becoming more reactive to any movement in his space." "Look at how he's fixating on us," Dr. Lopez explained. "His body language is tense. He's calculating, watching every move we make. And he's not giving any signs of submission. He's asserting control over his environment." Emily swallowed hard. She had seen it, had sensed it in Kumo's behavior, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it all too real. Her heart ached as she looked at her once playful companion. The jaguar she had raised from a cub was now a creature of instinct, and those instincts were taking over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily felt a growing sense of unease as she entered the sanctuary. Kumo's behavior had become more unpredictable by the hour. He had begun growling at her whenever she entered his enclosure, a deep, menacing sound that sent chills down her spine. At first, she'd written it off as a reaction to the changing light or noise, but now it was constant. Emily found herself approaching Kumo with trepidation, her steps slow and cautious. She kept her distance, not wanting to provoke him. When she tried to feed him, Kumo recoiled from the food. His eyes, once filled with affection, now seemed empty and distant. It was as though he no longer recognized her, no longer trusted her. His wild nature was coming to the forefront, and Emily was struggling to reconcile the animal he had become with the cub she had raised. That night, everything changed. Emily entered Kumo's enclosure as usual, holding a tray of fresh meat. But when she stepped into the cage, Kumo didn't approach her. Instead, he stood still, his eyes locked onto her. His muscles tensed as he crouched low to the ground, preparing for something. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she felt an overwhelming sense of danger. Her hands shook as she slowly lowered the tray to the ground, not wanting to make any sudden movements. "Kumo," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It's okay, boy. It's okay. But Kumo didn't move. The air between them felt thick, heavy with the tension of unspoken fear. Emily slowly stepped back, trying to retreat to the safety of the fence, but Kumo's growl stopped her in her tracks. He was no longer the gentle creature who had once curled up beside her. This was a wild animal, one whose instincts were now in full control. Just as Emily turned to leave, Kumo lunged. The movement was fast, too fast for her to react. She felt a surge of panic as she ducked, narrowly avoiding the swipe of his massive paw. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, crashing into the enclosure wall. She managed to get to her feet and escaped the enclosure, her breath ragged in her chest. As she shut the door behind her, Kumo continued to pace, his growls echoing in the night. Emily was shaken. Her body trembled as she sat in her office, her head in her hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had always known that raising a wild animal came with risks, but she had never expected it to come to this. Kumo had never shown any signs of aggression toward her before. Now, that very aggression had nearly cost her everything. The days that followed were filled with a deep sense of dread. Emily couldn't stop replaying the scene in her head. She knew Kumo wasn't to blame. This wasn't his fault. He was simply becoming the animal he was meant to be. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. She had raised him, loved him, and now she was faced with a heartbreaking reality. Kumo was no longer safe to be around. Not for her. Not for anyone. Emily spent hours talking to wildlife experts, trying to figure out the best course of action. She knew that she couldn't keep Kumo in the sanctuary any longer. His instincts were too strong, and the danger he posed was too great. But the thought of giving him up, of letting go of the animal she had cared for since he was a cub, was something she couldn't fathom. She had promised herself that she would never abandon him, but she realized now that the greatest act of love she could offer Kumo was to let him go. It took days of agonizing over the decision, but Emily finally called in a wildlife rescue team. They were professionals, trained to handle large cats like Kumo, and they assured her that they could relocate him to a sanctuary where he would have the space he needed to roam freely and live with other jaguars. The decision felt like a death sentence to Emily. She couldn't bear the thought of Kumo being far away, in a place where she couldn't visit him or care for him. But she knew it was the right thing to do. Kumo needed to live in the wild, not in captivity, and she couldn't keep him locked away in a sanctuary where his instincts would always be suppressed. The day the rescue team arrived, Emily stood by the fence of Kumo's enclosure, watching as they prepared the transport crate. Her heart ached with each passing moment. She wanted to run to him, to tell him how much she loved him, but she knew it was too late for that. The jaguar she had raised from a cub was gone. In his place was a wild animal who needed to be free. As the team sedated Kumo and placed him in the crate, Emily whispered a final goodbye. She told him that she loved him, that she would always remember him. She promised him that he would find the freedom he deserved. And as the truck drove away, carrying Kumo to his new life, Emily's heart shattered. She had done what was best for him, but the emptiness in her heart was something she would carry with her forever. Emily stood at the edge of Kumo's enclosure, her eyes fixed on the majestic jaguar pacing back and forth within the fence. The space she had built for him was large, a sprawling sanctuary where he could roam freely, but today, he seemed restless. His powerful muscles rippled beneath his sleek coat as he moved with a grace that only a wild animal could possess. He had grown so much over the years, no longer the tiny cub she had found abandoned in the jungle, but a full-grown jaguar, a creature of the wild, with instincts that now seemed impossible to ignore. Emily's heart twisted as she watched him. Kumo had always been more than just a pet to her. He had been her companion, her confidant, the creature she had poured her heart into raising. From the first time she had found him, abandoned and frail, she knew that their bond would be something extraordinary. She had treated him like family, and in return, he had offered her his unwavering trust and affection. It had been a relationship like no other, something that transcended the usual boundaries between humans and animals. But now, things were different. It had been weeks since she had noticed the first signs of change in Kumo's behavior. At first, it was subtle, just a brief flash of tension in his muscles, a growl when she approached his favorite spot in the enclosure, a flicker of something primal in his eyes. But over time, the changes became harder to ignore. Kumo had always been gentle with her, always trusting, but now there was something in his gaze that made her pause. It was as though he was seeing her differently, as though he was remembering what he truly was. A wild animal. A predator. Emily's stomach churned as she thought about the warnings she had received from others. Wildlife experts, friends, even some of the sanctuary staff had raised concerns. Kumo is getting too big, Emily, they had said. He's a jaguar, and no matter how much you love him, his instincts will eventually take over. It's in his nature. Emily had refused to believe them, convinced that her bond with Kumo was strong enough to defy anything. But now, as she watched him pacing in front of her, the truth was undeniable. She could no longer ignore the fact that Kumo was a wild animal, and she was no longer in control. The air felt thick with tension as Kumo stopped in his tracks, his intense yellow eyes locking with hers. Emily held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time had frozen. Then, Kumo turned and stalked off toward the back of the enclosure, his tail flicking behind him. Emily's body sagged in relief, but it was short-lived. The weight of what she had been avoiding for so long was now impossible to escape. She had always known that there would come a day when Kumo would have to face his wild side, but she had hoped that day would never come. She had raised him, loved him, nurtured him, and she had believed that somehow they would be different, that their bond would be enough to keep him safe. But now, Emily understood that she had been fooling herself. Kumo was not just her companion, he was a wild animal, and his instincts would eventually take over. She had always known it deep down, but now, as she stood there watching him retreat to the shadows of his enclosure, she had to face the truth. The next morning, Emily awoke early, her mind racing with thoughts of Kumo. She had been up late the night before, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that she was about to lose him. It was the first time in years that she had felt such a deep sense of unease about their relationship. She loved him, of course she did. But did she love him enough to let him go? To acknowledge that his true nature could never be fully tamed? She went to the sanctuary, as she did every day, but this time, it felt different. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, and the air was cool with the promise of a new day. Emily walked toward Kumo's enclosure, her heart in her throat. She knew that today, something had to change. She had tried to ignore the warnings, to deny the reality of what was happening, but she could no longer live in denial. When she reached the enclosure, Kumo was waiting for her. He was sitting near the fence, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He was watching her in a way that was different from how he had watched her before, distant, calculating, as though he was trying to understand her. Emily stopped just inside the gate, her hands trembling as she reached for the latch. Her breath caught in her chest as she realized that Kumo was no longer the playful cub she had raised. He was a full-grown jaguar, a creature who could easily overpower her, and he knew it. And as much as it hurt her to admit it, she knew that it was time to make a choice. The decision was the hardest she had ever made. Kumo had been with her through everything, through the highs and lows, the joys and the heartbreaks. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He had been her constant, her companion, and she had been his. They had shared a bond that felt unbreakable, a love that transcended all other relationships. But now, the reality of his nature had caught up with her. He was not meant to be confined, not meant to live in a sanctuary created by human hands. His place was in the wild, where he could roam freely and hunt without restraint, where his instincts could be fully realized. Emily closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she turned away from Kumo's enclosure. She had to let him go. As much as it hurt her to think about it, she knew it was the right thing to do. Kumo needed space to be who he truly was, to fulfill his purpose in the world. And she couldn't give that to him, no matter how much she loved him. Over the next few days, Emily made the necessary arrangements for Kumo's relocation. She contacted the wildlife experts, asking them to help find a sanctuary where Kumo could live alongside other jaguars, where he could thrive in an environment that suited his nature. The thought of sending him away nearly broke her heart, but she knew it was for the best. Kumo deserved more than what she could offer him. He deserved to be free. On the day of Kumo's relocation, Emily stood in front of the sanctuary, her hands clasped tightly together. The transport team had arrived early in the morning to prepare Kumo for the journey. He was sedated, just enough to make the process smooth, but Emily could still feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As Kumo was carefully loaded into the transport crate, Emily fought back the tears. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded for so long. The jaguar she had raised, the creature she had loved with all her heart, was being taken away from her. And it was the hardest thing she had ever done. As the transport vehicle pulled away, Emily stood in silence, watching it disappear down the road. She felt an emptiness in her chest, a hollow ache that seemed to consume her. She had done the right thing, she told herself. But it didn't make it any easier. She had let go of the creature she had raised, the creature who had been her closest companion for so many years. And though she knew that Kumo would be better off in the wild, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. Would he remember her? Would he miss her the way she would miss him? The sanctuary felt empty now, quieter than it had ever been. The birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees, but it was all so still, so silent. Kumo's absence was a constant ache in Emily's chest, a reminder that sometimes love meant letting go. She had done what was best for him, but it didn't make the pain any less real. As she walked away from the empty enclosure, Emily's heart was heavy, but she knew deep down that she had done the right thing. Kumo was free now. And so was she. Emily sat in her small office, the walls lined with photographs of the animals she had helped over the years. Her gaze lingered on a picture of Kumo, taken when he was still a small, innocent cub, curled up in her arms, oblivious to the dangers of the world. She could remember the first time she had held him, the warmth of his tiny body against her chest, and the trust that had grown between them over the years. But now, that trust felt fragile, as though it might shatter at any moment. Kumo was no longer the playful cub she had raised, he was a powerful, unpredictable jaguar, and Emily was terrified of what might happen if his instincts took over. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. She had called the wildlife rescue team earlier that day, asking for help, but now that they were on their way, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to lose the only family she had left. She had raised Kumo from a helpless, abandoned cub to the majestic creature he was today. She had given him everything, her love, her time, her heart, and now she had to let him go. The weight of that decision was suffocating. As the phone rang, Emily's mind raced. She had tried to reason with herself, telling herself that Kumo's behavior was just a phase, that he was still the same animal she had cared for. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Something had changed. His instincts were starting to override the bond they had formed, and no matter how much she loved him, she couldn't deny that he was becoming more unpredictable with each passing day. "Hello, Emily," the voice on the other end of the line was calm, but there was an underlying tension. "We got your call. We're on our way to help." "I don't know what to do," Emily said, her voice breaking. "He's not the same anymore. I don't think I can keep him here. But I don't want to lose him. He's everything to me." "We understand," the rescuer said gently. "You've done everything you can for him, but now it's time for him to be with others of his kind. The jungle or sanctuary is where Kumo truly belongs, and that's where he'll be safe. You're not giving up on him. You're giving him the opportunity to live his life as a jaguar, not as a pet." Emily took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that threatened to spill over. She knew the rescuer was right. Kumo had never truly belonged in her sanctuary, not when he had become so wild, so untamable. She couldn't control what he was becoming, and she couldn't pretend any longer that everything would be okay. She needed to let him go for his sake. "I'll be waiting for you," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. When the wildlife rescue team arrived, Emily stood at the door, her heart heavy with grief. The team had already prepared for the relocation, knowing that Kumo's behavior was becoming too dangerous for her to manage alone. They had come with a large transport crate and the equipment necessary to sedate the Jaguar for a peaceful transfer. As they stepped out of their vehicle, Emily's stomach twisted. She didn't want this to happen. She didn't want to say goodbye. The team leader, a man named Mark, approached her with a reassuring smile. He had been in situations like this before, but Emily could see the sadness in his eyes. It was hard for anyone to understand how deeply she loved Kumo. They'd never been as close to an animal as she had been with him. Still, the moment of parting had come. "We're ready," Mark said, giving her a sympathetic look. "We'll take good care of him. He'll be in a place where he can roam freely, away from the confines of your sanctuary. He'll be in a more natural environment." Emily nodded, though the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. She had spent years with Kumo, feeding him, watching him grow, and learning from him. But now, she had to face the painful reality that she couldn't keep him any longer. He had to be free, just like he was meant to be. She had raised him, but she wasn't prepared to lose him. The rescue team approached Kumo's enclosure, and the Jaguar immediately noticed the strangers. He tensed, pacing along the fence, his eyes narrowed. Emily stepped back, allowing the team to do their work. Kumo wasn't the same animal he had been all those years ago. His once playful demeanor had been replaced with a more primal, alert presence. It was clear he had outgrown her sanctuary, and it was dangerous to keep him confined. "Stay back," Mark advised. "We're going to sedate him so we can safely transport him." Emily's heart raced. She watched as one of the team members used a tranquilizer dart, carefully aimed at Kumo. The dart hit its mark, and for a moment, Kumo let out a low growl before his body relaxed. Slowly, he collapsed to the ground, his breathing steady as the sedative took effect. Emily's legs felt weak beneath her as she took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving Kumo's still form. This was it. This was the last time she would see him like this, in the sanctuary they had shared. The reality of it all hit her like a wave, threatening to drown her in its intensity. She reached out to touch Kumo's for one final time, but her hand trembled, hovering just above his body. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this to happen. I love you, Kumo." The team gently placed Kumo into the transport crate, and Emily stood back, holding onto the last shred of the bond they had shared. She felt as though her heart was being ripped out of her chest. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But she had to do it, for Kumo. He was no longer a cub who needed her protection, he was a wild animal, and it was time for him to live the life he was meant to live. As the team loaded the crate into their vehicle, Emily stood there, unable to move. The sound of the wheels crunching on the gravel echoed in her mind as the transport vehicle slowly pulled away. Kumo was gone, taken to a new home where he could live freely. Emily's heart ached with each passing second, but deep down, she knew this was the right decision. She had made the hardest choice of her life, and although it hurt beyond words, she had to trust that Kumo would be better off in a place where he could truly be himself. She walked back into her sanctuary, the empty cages surrounding her like ghosts of the past. Her eyes wandered over the place she had spent so many years building, nurturing, and protecting. Kumo had once been a part of this, but now the silence felt overwhelming. She couldn't keep him here anymore. It wasn't safe for either of them. But that didn't make the ache in her chest any easier to bear. As she sat down on the bench outside, Emily closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely. She had been his protector, his mother, his companion, and now she had to let him go. But it was for the best. Kumo would thrive in the wild, with other jaguars, where he could run free and live his life the way he was meant to. And maybe, just maybe, that would help Emily heal, too. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked down to see a message from Mark. "We've arrived at the sanctuary. Kumo is settling in. He's in good hands." Emily stared at the message for a long time, letting the words sink in. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't easy, and it would never be easy, but Emily knew that Kumo would be okay. And that was enough. As the days passed, Emily began to process everything. She had raised Kumo, but it was time for him to live his life without her. She had given him all she could, and now she had to let go. But she knew that the bond they shared would never disappear. It was something that no distance could ever take away. Kumo had found his place in the world, and Emily had found hers. She would always carry the memories of their time together in her heart, knowing that she had given him the best life she could. She had raised a Jaguar, and in doing so, she had learned what true love, sacrifice, and freedom really meant. The day of Kumo's relocation arrived, and the weight of the decision pressed heavily on Emily's chest. Her sanctuary, once a place of joy and shared moments with the Jaguar she had raised, now felt like a prison, a place where both she and Kumo were trapped in a situation neither of them could control. Emily had spent countless sleepless nights battling her emotions, questioning whether this was the right choice. But now, as the day dawned, there was no turning back. She stood by the large enclosure, watching as the wildlife rescue team prepared for Kumo's transport. The air was thick with tension. Emily could barely bring herself to look at Kumo, knowing the moment was approaching. She knew what had to be done, but her heart shattered with every passing minute. This was the Jaguar she had raised since he was just a small, fragile cub, his motherless eyes wide with fear when she first found him in the jungle. She had fed him, comforted him, and watched him grow into the powerful, beautiful creature now pacing inside the enclosure. But today, Kumo would leave her care. Today, their bond, forged over years of companionship, would come to an end. The transport team, consisting of animal behaviorists and wildlife experts, had been preparing for days. They had come equipped with a large crate designed for Kumo's size, reinforced and padded to ensure his comfort during the journey. Emily had made it clear from the beginning that she wanted to be there, that she couldn't bear to let Kumo go without seeing him one last time. But now that the moment was here, the fear in her heart was overwhelming. She wasn't just worried about Kumo's future, she was worried about herself. The thought of him in another sanctuary, far from her, was too much to bear. "Emily, are you ready?" One of the experts, Dr. Hernandez, asked gently as he approached. His voice was soft, understanding, but it still carried a sense of urgency. He knew this was hard for her. He had seen countless situations like this before, but it was always difficult to watch someone struggle with the reality of letting go. He had warned her time and time again, but Emily had insisted on staying with Kumo for as long as possible. He had been raised in the sanctuary, after all. This was his home. Or so she thought. "I'm ready," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She had to be. There was no other choice. Dr. Hernandez nodded, though his eyes softened with sympathy. He could see how much this hurt. There was no easy way to break the bond they shared, no way to remove the years of affection and trust that had been built between them. But the safety of both Emily and Kumo had to come first. "Okay, we'll get started now. We've already sedated him lightly so that the move is as stress-free as possible." Emily turned her gaze toward Kumo's enclosure. He was pacing back and forth, his large body moving with such grace that it seemed almost effortless. But there was a sense of agitation in his movements, a tension in the air that Emily could feel in her bones. He could sense the change coming. Kumo, once a playful cub, was now a grown Jaguar, stronger, wilder, and more unpredictable. His behavior had been becoming increasingly erratic in recent months, and while she loved him with all her heart, Emily knew she couldn't control him forever. He needed space to roam, a place where he could live out his instincts as a wild animal. The sanctuary, no matter how much she had tried to make it a safe place for him, was no longer suitable. He was no longer the cub she had raised, he was a creature of the wild, and it was time for him to return to that life. But as Emily stood there, watching him, a sharp pang of guilt pierced her heart. What if he didn't understand? What if he thought she was abandoning him? Kumo had been her companion, her friend. They had shared so many quiet moments together, moments where words were unnecessary. They had communicated with their eyes, their gestures, their very presence. He had trusted her with his life, and now she was sending him away. Was this truly the best decision for him? The transport team began the process of moving Kumo into the crate. The sedative had begun to take effect, and Kumo's steps slowed. He stopped pacing, his powerful frame stilling in the center of the enclosure as his eyes locked with Emily's. For a moment, everything else faded away, the transport team, the stress, the fear. It was just Emily and Kumo. The bond between them was tangible, stretching across the years, built on care, love, and mutual respect. She felt the tears well up, but she blinked them away, determined to remain strong. She had to be strong for him. Kumo's gaze never left her. He blinked slowly, his eyes softening as though he understood something was changing, though the full truth of what was happening was beyond his grasp. Emily took a tentative step forward, her hand reaching out toward the bars of the enclosure. Kumo responded by stepping toward her, his head low, his movements slow and deliberate. His body language was calm, but there was an edge to his movements, something that reminded her that he was still a wild animal, capable of unpredictability. Yet, there was also a trust in his eyes, a trust that had been built over years of gentle care. "I'll miss you," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She reached through the bars and gently stroked his fur, feeling the softness of it under her fingertips. Kumo leaned into her touch, his body relaxing as he nuzzled her hand. For a brief moment, everything felt right again. She felt the years of connection in that one simple gesture. But as much as she wanted to stay, as much as she longed to hold him one last time, she knew she couldn't. She had to let him go. It was time. The team carefully loaded Kumo into the crate. His body was heavy, and the sedative had left him lethargic, but there was no mistaking the power that lay beneath his fur. Once inside the crate, Kumo settled down, his large form curling into a space that was just large enough for him to stretch out comfortably. Emily watched as the team secured the crate and began preparing for the journey ahead. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the end of an era. Kumo was no longer the baby Jaguar she had raised, he was a grown animal, and it was time for him to find his place in the world. It was painful, but it was right. "Goodbye, Kumo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll always love you." With one final look at the crate, Emily turned away. The transport vehicle was already running, ready to carry Kumo to his new home. The sanctuary, the place where they had shared so many memories, now seemed too small, too suffocating. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. She took a few steps back, her hands trembling, as the vehicle began to drive away. Kumo was leaving her life for good. Emily stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as the truck disappeared from view. Her heart felt empty, hollow, as though the very air around her had been sucked away. She had done the right thing. She knew that. She had given Kumo the best life she could, and now, he would be where he truly belonged, a sanctuary for jaguars in the wild, a place where he could roam free and embrace his true nature. But the truth didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The love she had for Kumo was still there, but now it was accompanied by a deep ache, a yearning for something she couldn't change. She turned slowly, her footsteps heavy as she walked back toward the sanctuary's entrance. She had taken care of Kumo for years, but now she was left with nothing but an empty space and a broken heart. The quiet of the sanctuary seemed almost unbearable, the stillness an overwhelming reminder of what she had just lost. But as she stood in the midst of the empty enclosures, Emily knew one thing for certain: she had done everything she could for Kumo, and now it was his turn to live the life he was always meant to have. Even if it meant she had to say goodbye. The morning Kumo was finally taken to the sanctuary was a heavy one, filled with an unsettling mixture of dread and acceptance. Emily stood by the window of her cabin, watching as the team from the Wildlife Rescue Organization made their preparations. The sight of them unloading crates, checking equipment, and discussing the logistics of the move felt surreal. Everything felt surreal. How could the day that marked the end of her life with Kumo be happening so soon? The Jaguar, the animal she had raised from a tiny, trembling cub, was being moved to a place where he could finally live in peace, but without her. Her heart ached at the thought of him never again looking up at her with those trusting, soft eyes. Emily could hardly breathe as she looked out at Kumo in his enclosure. She saw him pacing, moving restlessly back and forth, his large body rippling with muscle beneath the tawny fur. His behavior was erratic, just like it had been for the last few weeks. That was the first sign of change, the first sign that the bond they had shared, once so unbreakable, was no longer enough to keep him calm. She still remembered the way he had been as a cub, the way he would curl up in her lap at night, purring contentedly. Now, he was a creature full of wild energy and untamable instincts. He was no longer the playful kitten who would nuzzle her hand for affection. Now, he was a powerful, unpredictable force of nature. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the anxiety gripping her chest was too much. She hadn't been able to prepare herself for this moment, for the reality of what was happening. The team had explained the situation over and over again, how Kumo needed to be placed in a larger sanctuary where he could be around other jaguars, where he could live in a natural, protected environment. But none of it made the decision easier. She felt like she was abandoning him, even though she knew, deep down, that it was the right thing for both of them. The wildlife team members moved efficiently, their experience evident in the way they handled everything. They knew this was never an easy transition, especially for an animal as bonded to a human as Kumo had been. One team member carefully approached the cage, speaking softly to Kumo to calm him. Emily couldn't bear to watch, her heart was racing, and her hands were clammy. She took a step back, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to overwhelm her. She had raised him, loved him, cared for him, and now, it felt like she was about to lose him forever. Kumo turned his eyes toward her for just a moment, and in that brief look, Emily saw everything she needed to understand. His eyes, once so trusting and loving, were now filled with confusion. He didn't understand what was happening, and neither did she. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but she knew that the path they were on had already been set. There was no turning back. The team was ready to transport him, and she couldn't risk staying too close, not when there was so much tension in the air. As they sedated him to ensure the transport would be smooth, Emily felt a sharp pang of guilt. This wasn't just about safety anymore, it was about the very nature of what Kumo was, a wild animal. And no matter how much love she had given him, he could never be fully tamed. The knowledge that his instincts were always going to win out, eventually, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had raised him with the hope that their bond would last forever, that love would conquer all. But nature had its own rules, and love was not enough to keep a jaguar from becoming what it was meant to be. The moment they loaded Kumo into the large transport crate, the silence in the air was suffocating. Emily's heart cracked as she watched them secure the crate, preparing to move him to the vehicle. She wanted to run to him, to hug him one last time, but the fear in her chest stopped her. There was nothing more she could do. She couldn't save him from his nature, and he couldn't stay with her forever. Kumo was already too wild, too unpredictable. It would never be safe for either of them if she kept him here, no matter how deep her feelings were. The wildlife team leader approached Emily, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll take good care of him. He's going to a place where he'll have room to roam and be with others of his kind. It's what's best for him now." Emily nodded, forcing a smile, but it was impossible to ignore the heavy weight in her chest. "I know. I just don't want him to forget me." "You'll always be a part of his story," the team leader said. "But Kumo is a wild animal. He needs to be with others like him, not humans. This is the next step in his journey." Emily watched as the transport van doors closed with a soft thud, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had been left behind with Kumo. She stood there for a long time, rooted to the spot, staring at the empty enclosure. The silence around her seemed louder than ever, and she realized how hollow the sanctuary felt without Kumo in it. This was the place where they had shared so many memories, her feeding him, his playful growls, the way he had once curled up at her feet for warmth. But now, it felt like a place of loss, a space that was too big for the tiny cub he once had been. The truck carrying Kumo pulled away, and Emily felt an overwhelming rush of emptiness wash over her. She had done the right thing, she kept telling herself, but that didn't make it any easier. She wanted to turn back time and live in the moments when Kumo had trusted her, when his wild instincts hadn't taken over. But time couldn't be turned back, and the reality of what was happening was settling in. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. She took a long, shaky breath, her eyes focused on the horizon. She had spent years building a life with Kumo, and in an instant, it was over. She had made the right decision, but it felt like the worst decision she could have ever made. She knew Kumo would thrive in his new environment, that he would finally have the space he needed, but a part of her still wished she could have kept him in her care forever. Days passed, and the weight of the decision lingered. Emily would often find herself staring out the window, lost in thought, wondering what Kumo was doing now, whether he was adjusting well to his new home, whether he had forgotten her yet. It was almost unbearable to think about. She missed him more than she had thought possible. Then, one afternoon, she received the first update. It was a short message from the wildlife rescue team, assuring her that Kumo had made the transition well. He was in a larger enclosure with other jaguars, and his behavior was stabilizing. The message was brief, but filled with optimism. Emily couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. At least he was safe. At least he was where he belonged. But the relief was fleeting. No matter how much she tried to remind herself that this was the right thing, the sadness never fully left her. The emptiness in her home was a constant reminder of the life she had lost. She had done what was best for Kumo, and yet, the ache in her chest refused to subside. The months that followed brought a mixture of emotions, grief, guilt, relief, and a strange sense of peace that she couldn't quite explain. Emily knew that Kumo was living the life he was meant to live, free to roam with others of his kind. But she couldn't forget the Jaguar that had once been her baby, the one she had raised with so much love and care. As the seasons changed, Emily began to heal, slowly. She found solace in knowing that she had done the best she could for Kumo, even if it meant letting go. She still missed him, but she understood that love didn't always mean keeping someone close. Sometimes, it meant letting go, so that they could become who they were always meant to be. And so, the chapter with Kumo ended, leaving Emily with memories of their time together, memories of a bond so strong, yet so fleeting. She had raised a Jaguar, loved it as her own, and let it go when the time was right. Though her heart was heavy, she knew that Kumo was where he belonged. And that was enough. The days following Kumo's relocation were filled with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Emily found herself standing in the now quiet sanctuary, her eyes wandering across the empty enclosures, each one a stark reminder of the life she once shared with the Jaguar she had raised. The sounds of the jungle that once felt so familiar, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and Kumo's soft growls, had been replaced by silence. The absence of his presence felt suffocating, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision she had made. She had spent weeks grappling with her emotions before finally agreeing to Kumo's move to the new sanctuary. Every time she tried to imagine life without him, her heart would tighten in her chest, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Kumo was no longer the playful cub who had curled up in her arms all those years ago. He had grown into a powerful, majestic creature, one whose instincts were driven by the wildness of his nature, not the domesticated love she had once believed could bind them forever. In the first few days after his departure, Emily would find herself standing by the empty enclosure where Kumo had once roamed, her hand brushing the bars as if to reach out to him. Her thoughts would wander back to the early days, remembering the way he had looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. He had needed her then. But now, as the Jaguar she had raised had become an adult, she knew that he needed something more. He needed space. He needed freedom. He needed to reconnect with the wild that had always been a part of him, even if she hadn't been ready to accept it. Emily's life felt different now. The sanctuary had become quieter, emptier, and with each passing day, the reality of Kumo's absence sank in deeper. She found herself surrounded by the animals she cared for, yet none of them seemed to fill the void he had left. There was no other animal in the sanctuary who shared the bond that she had had with him, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was for the best, her heart couldn't shake the sadness. In the days following his departure, she received regular updates from the new sanctuary. The reports were positive, as Kumo was slowly adjusting to life with other jaguars. He was finally able to roam freely, to engage with other members of his species, and, as the reports suggested, he had started showing signs of socialization, something that Emily had always hoped he would experience. The wildlife team had noted that he was beginning to exhibit more of his natural behavior, hunting, playing, and communicating with other jaguars. It was a relief to know that Kumo was thriving in his new home. Still, each update brought with it a bittersweet sense of pride and sorrow. Emily would sit by the window in her living room, gazing out at the jungle, and let her mind wander back to the days when Kumo had been her world. She remembered the way he had pressed his face into her palms when he was a cub, the softness of his fur, the way he would pounce on her with playful abandon. She had taught him everything she could, how to navigate the sanctuary, how to trust, how to live without fear. And yet, it seemed that Kumo's lessons were far from over, and now she had to let him finish them on his own, in the wild. But there were times when the silence in her home was deafening. She would find herself walking through the sanctuary, her feet dragging as she passed the enclosures where other animals were kept. None of them were Kumo. None of them had the same gaze, the same spirit. Even the big cats in the neighboring enclosures, tigers and leopards, didn't compare to Kumo. He had always been different. There had been something special about him, something that made him stand out from all the other animals in her care. Perhaps it was his intelligence, or perhaps it was the unique bond they had shared, a bond that had been formed over years of shared experiences. But even as she longed for his presence, she knew that letting go was the right thing. Kumo's instincts had been calling to him for months. She had seen it in his eyes as he started pacing around the sanctuary, restless and agitated. He was a wild animal, after all, and no matter how much she had nurtured him, his primal nature was always there, lurking beneath the surface. Emily had raised him in a safe, controlled environment, but as the years had gone by, it had become clear that the sanctuary was no longer the right place for him. He needed space to roam, to explore, to embrace the wild that had always been a part of him. One evening, as Emily sat by the fire in her living room, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, but as she opened the door, she was met by the familiar face of the wildlife team's lead biologist, Dr. Gomez. He was holding a folder in his hand, and his face looked serious. "I have something important to share," he said, stepping inside without waiting for her to invite him. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had been bracing herself for more updates, but she wasn't sure what this one would bring. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Gomez took a deep breath before handing her the folder. "It's about Kumo," he said gently. "We've received some troubling news." Emily's stomach twisted. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. The report outlined Kumo's behavior since his arrival at the new sanctuary. At first, everything had seemed fine. He had adjusted well to the new environment, he had interacted with the other jaguars, and he had shown signs of thriving. But the report also mentioned that Kumo's aggression had escalated. While he had always been a solitary animal by nature, the interaction with other wild jaguars seemed to trigger something within him. He had become territorial, violent even, toward some of the other animals in the sanctuary. There were reports of fights, and Kumo had been involved in several altercations with other male jaguars. Dr. Gomez paused before continuing. "We're worried about Kumo," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and sadness. "His aggression is reaching dangerous levels, and while we're doing everything we can to help him, we fear that the situation may escalate." Emily's heart sank. She had always known that Kumo's instincts could take over, but she had never imagined that things would escalate this quickly. The thought of Kumo being in such turmoil broke her. The sanctuary that she had believed would offer him a better life was now a place of struggle and violence, and it was clear that Kumo was struggling to find his place in the world. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She had done everything she could for Kumo. She had raised him with love and care, but now she felt like she was losing him all over again. It was as if, despite everything, she had failed him. Dr. Gomez placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't fail him," he said softly. "But sometimes, wild animals need more than what we can give them. We can't change their nature, no matter how much we want to. Kumo needs the freedom to express himself fully, but that comes with risks. We'll do everything we can to manage it, but there are no guarantees." As the days passed, Emily's mind remained consumed by the reports from the sanctuary. She couldn't help but feel responsible for Kumo's pain, even though she knew deep down that it wasn't her fault. She had loved him, cared for him, and given him everything she could, but Kumo's wild nature was beyond her control. And as painful as it was, she had to accept that Kumo's journey was no longer hers to guide. He had to find his own way, just as she had to find hers. One morning, Emily stood by the window, staring out at the jungle, and she realized something. No matter how much she missed Kumo, no matter how much she wished she could hold him again, she had to let him go. She had always known that Kumo was meant for more than the sanctuary could offer him. Now, she understood that his journey was one she couldn't dictate. The sadness she felt was real, but it was also a reflection of her love for him. She had to trust that Kumo would find his way in the world, just as he had always been destined to do. As the weeks turned into months, Emily received fewer updates. The news from the sanctuary had become less frequent, and though the occasional report reassured her that Kumo was still alive, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was far from the animal he once was. The Jaguar she had raised was no longer a part of her life, and no matter how much she had loved him, she had to accept that his place in the world was somewhere beyond her reach. In her heart, Emily knew that Kumo was where he belonged. Even though it hurt, she found peace in knowing that he was finally free to live the life he had always been meant to lead. And as she gazed out into the jungle, she whispered a final goodbye to the Jaguar she had raised, the one she had loved so deeply. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.